Our next clinician is the immediate past superintendent of the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the NMRA. He models the Coal Creek Lumber Company on a beautiful S-scale layout in narrow gauge. For a peek into modeling some explosive things, please welcome Mr. Russ Segner.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you today. I want to talk about the DuPont Dynamite factory that was at one time very active in DuPont, Washington. DuPont is midway between Tacoma, for those of you who know the area, and Olympia, the state capital of Washington. It's there, DuPont is there because in 1906, the DuPont company built a factory to manufacture dynamite. Dynamite was very important because of the need for an explosive that was safer than black powder to work in the mines and building the roads, particularly the railroads, into the Northwest. So I want to talk a little bit about DuPont. I became aware of it when one of our NMRA groups locally held a tour of the plant site and a barbecue an afternoon, and I became aware of what was remaining from the plant. This is the plant layout from an old map with the trackage as of 1950. It had extensive 3-foot narrow gauge trackage throughout the plant, as well as some standard gauge tracks operated by the Northern Pacific that access many of the areas of the plant. So here's an updated map that a friend of mine, Mike Connolly, who's really adept at map making, developed from that previous one, which shows a more clearer impression of the buildings as they're located throughout the trackage. You'll see there are 3 basic areas: a powder line area, an acid area, and a packaging area where it mentions NG, that's nitroglycerin. Weyerhaeuser Company purchased the property in 1977 because they had planned to build a access to the water for shipping logs to Japan. And when that transaction was complete, the federal government immediately changed the law with regard to shipping raw logs to Japan. So Weyerhaeuser had absolutely no reason to hold this property. About 1,000 acres, located on Puget Sound, right next to Fort Lewis McChord. So they sold it to Quadrant Corporation, which is this wholly owned subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser Company. They build housing. In this case, they were going to build a planned unit community with a golf course, commercial center, and a small business park. What we see here is the remnant of one of the areas of the plant in the location of what we now know as Gelignite Cartridge House number 1. And you can see there in the curve in the foreground some of the track that was left in place. The concrete abutments separated 2 buildings where Gelignite cartridges were loaded, and a berm surrounded those buildings on 3 sides to protect them in case one of them had an ignition. This is the location taken from a different angle, and you can see beyond the middle building there a grassy or weed-covered berm, and then the red roof of that same plant. And the berm was there to deflect any explosion, to keep all of the plant's buildings from going up in one shot. There you see a good depiction of the trackage, little cart that they were using to push materials between the buildings. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And you notice the planking between the tracks. That was to make it easier for the workmen to push those carts amongst the buildings. The site was leveled, and so there was not a huge problem rolling the carts. But during the winter and the rainy season, which is about 11 months of the year here, the planking helped make it easier to walk and maintain your footing. This is a similar location near one of the magazines, and again you can see the berm behind the locomotive there, and the building where the 3 cars being loaded, and a flat car and idler car in between. Here's a picture of a string of those flat cars. These are 20-footers, steel framed. We'll see a lot more about these in a little bit. This is after the plant's closed down, and so I'm thinking these are a string of cars here gathered as they were going to dismantle the plant. There's another shot of the mechanic chains house looking northwest. Here's a typical building, and I'm sharing this because it depicts the roofing and the siding, corrugated metal. Most of them were, except for a few that we'll see that were masonry construction. The floor in this building is at the height of the flat car. They had handled large rolls of paper products to build the Dynamite cartridges, as well as 55-gallon drums of all manner of chemicals. This is another typical building. For purposes of model railroading, these are ideal structures because you can make them any length you want, and where we're forced to foreshorten everything pretty much, and the materials are pretty straightforward to build with. Here's a picture of the carpenter shop on the right, and several other buildings on the left. The buildings with the ventilators on top are probably used to house changing rooms and that sort of thing. And those ventilators are there for ventilation. It's changing the air from the outfits that people wore in the factory. Take a notice of the switch stands. Pretty basic little mechanism. I've not seen one of these modeled. The trackage throughout here is 3-foot narrow gauge. Another couple of buildings, similar construction. These do not have explosives in them because there are no berms around them. This one's interesting because it's a gas station. They had a number of vehicles on site, including this little locomotive, which is a 12-ton Plymouth we'll see a lot more of. And so this is where all the vehicles were brought to gas up. I'm unclear about whether or not they operated any diesels versus gasoline. The locomotive that we have today is a diesel locomotive. This is a shot showing the carpenter shop and lube storage with the gas pump down in the distance. Let me get my cursor here. Wrong. Here are the gas pumps down here. This building was used for storage of lubricants, 55-gallon drums. Here's a closer shot of the gas pumps. As you can see, the forest on this property is intermingled amongst many of the buildings at this point. And most of this has all been cleared flat for the golf course now. Here's the engine house, and this overhead gantry structure here is accessing the blacksmith shop, and then across is the laundry. Closer shot of the blacksmith shop. I want to talk a little bit about rolling stock. When the plant closed down, a great deal of the equipment, rolling stock, the flat cars, box cars, etc., were sold off to locals who used them for chicken coops and all manner of storage buildings and their other purposes. But fortunately, Weyerhaeuser retained several of the pieces of rolling stock and donated them to the museum. And this is how they looked as Weyerhaeuser left them all nicely, freshly painted in 1977-78. The boxcar is about 22 feet long. Notice the platforms on each end. The flat car on the left is steel frame. The flat car on the right is all wood frame. And that's a little 14-footer that we'll talk about. Here's an interesting piece of rolling stock. I had no idea what this was when I first got involved with the museum. I thought, well, maybe it carried big canvas bags of supplies and that sort of thing. But no, it was actually used to carry the racks of packaged dynamite sticks, the shells. Dynamite is basically encased in a cylindrical tube fashioned from paper that's cut on the diagonal. One of my friends, model railroader Jim Sable, worked in this plant in high school in the 50s, and that was one of his jobs. Once the tube is constructed, it's dipped in hot paraffin and placed in racks, sort of like gigantic milk cartons, the plastic milk crates, and slid into the racking arrangement on this car. And these were moved amongst the plant from the area where they were manufactured to the packaging facility. Here's one of the 14-footers. And Jim tells me that this most likely is at the area where the shells were made. You can tell from the canopy here on this building. This little 14-footer, this is number 8. The one we worked on was number 6. This is what we found. I recall a previous photograph where the cars were donated by Weyerhaeuser. These were in really, really good shape, but this is many, many years later when I visited the plant first with that group. And this was what the little 14-footer looked like. We had no good dimensions on it, but fortunately we had enough of the building that we could measure in from each end and get an accurate dimension for the length. And then the width was pretty straightforward since we knew the gauge of the track, and so on. We had just barely enough wood to get an accurate dimension for all of the components that we had that we remanufactured on site. It's a 2-axle unit with pedestals, and they basically held the car together. You can see this one is pretty, it's all there, fortunately, and it actually rotated over without any structure of the car to keep it straight. This is what it looked like many, many months later after we had rebuilt it. All of the wood was replaced. Fortunately, all of the steel was there. These various components were all in pretty good shape. We cleaned them up and took all the rust off and treated them with a preservative that converts the raw steel to something that will no longer oxidize, and replaced them on the car. It has 4 longitudinal beams that carry the car. The 2 outside ones rest on the pedestals. The 2 on the inside are suspended by cross members that rest on top of these outside beams and support the end of the car, the draft gear on each end. If you want to know anything about car building, go to work with one of the museums to restore one of these things. This is an example of a string of the steel framed flat cars. In this case, 55-gallon drums. I have no idea what's in them. Most likely these were drums filled with peanut shells or sawdust, which was used in the dynamite itself as a filler, and it emulsified all of the other components to make a handling material that was safe. Don't know the exact nature of this locomotive, but I suspect it was either compressed air or more likely a steam dummy to operate in amongst the plant. And we don't have one of these that survived. Here's a shot of several of us working on the steel framed flat car. Took all of the wood components that were there, stripped it down, cleaned all the rust off, and then fabricated the material that went on the inside of it to support the deck structure. These pieces were tapered on each edge to fit inside these steel forms, which were sort of like an inverted C. This is what the car looked like when we finished with it. Fortunately, again, we had all the steel and so on. I noticed particularly the very elaborate trucks on this car. About as basic as you can get. This is a 22-foot boxcar, and this is the same one that was in that picture that showed the donation from Weyerhaeuser. In this case, the car was pretty well beaten up. It had a broken underframe. The structural beams longitudinally here were fractured. The platforms at each end were in pretty bad shape, but basically all of it's there. In this case, it's got vertical siding and a roof that's circular or round with corrugated iron on top of it. We'll see a couple of examples of other similar cars. This is a good shot of the end platform. There was a brake wheel at each end, and often the cars were handled, particularly down grade, with a brakeman at the end of the car going down grade. This is an example of a car back east at one of the other DuPont plants. And again, you can see in this case, it's a sheathed siding, outside sheathed, and this is possibly plywood instead of vertical siding. This is from the same location, but notice the outside sheeting. And this would make a pretty good model for a contest, I think. And obviously repaired and kept in very, very good shape. I have no idea what's inside this. Some form of machinery, although this couldn't be that big a steel structure because it would be too heavy for this car. But they had something that was pretty bulky that needed to be stashed in this loading. This is one of them really interesting little cars. This is on one of those 14-footers, and it's a little maintenance car used throughout the plant with all kinds of tools on it, a toolbox on the end, and so on. I suspect it was used to work on maintenance of the track work. And this is one of the models that I'm going to build to finally finish my MMR. I have one of them built already. In S scale, that car, the model is about 1.25 inches long. I include this photograph because it's one of the only ones I have that shows clearly the lettering on the car. That was shot at the wharf. Talk a little bit about motive power. This is a Brookville locomotive. They built lots of these for various mining and logging operations throughout the country. That plant's back east still exists. This was a model that was left by a Weyerhaeuser and hooked onto one of those flight cars in pretty good shape. It had a Chrysler, or rather, I'm sorry, a Buick, a V8 engine in it. But notice particularly the spark arrestor mechanism here. They were quite conscious of the potential problem with sparks from locomotives. Although the Northern Pacific operated a steam locomotive inside the plant from their line that came in from the line out near what's now I-5. And they had a spot in the plant as the locomotive originally arrived where it moved under a spark arrestor, and that unit was lowered down on the stack and left on top of the locomotive as it moved throughout the plant. This is the surviving locomotive, and this is an operable unit, a 12-ton Plymouth. Was made operable by the city director of Public Works, who is still active in operating the locomotive for the museum, although he is now retired. And his name is Fred, and he and I and 3 other guys did most of the work on restoring the 2 flat cars that we'll talk about. And behind it here you see the storage building, a covered storage to protect the units that we have on display. Somebody needs to make a scratch build model out of this guy. Aristocraft makes an 18-tonner that's very similar to this, but it's much larger than this. We'll talk a little bit about the rail in a bit. It's a 30-pound rail, and we have one turnout on the campus here. We would make a double-ended siding if we could, but we don't have room for it right now. I was able to source, though, a 30-pound frog from the Ardenwood folks down in California. It's another shot of the Plymouth, which shows the left side. Here's the back of it, a little clearer, and this is at the gas pumps. Here's the right side. This is at the change house, one of them actually. We can see the ventilator on top. So in operating this thing, this is a good close-up of turnout control. You notice it's actuated with the lever, obviously, and the spring holds it in either position on this side or on this side, and makes an interesting prototype. The product was shipped out, off much of it by barge or freighter on Puget Sound, and this is one of the train sets going down the hill from the plant. It's about a 4.5% grade. You notice the locomotive here always on the downgrade side to avoid any runaway. Had an idler car here, and then 3 flat cars with loads on them, and a brakeman here toward the tail end. It's a color shot of this, pretty close to the same location. There is down in the creek bed here the remnants of a wrecked car that got away. I suspect the other cars and components were removed because they could be salvaged. This is now a trail that's accessed by the public. The rail could be restored, but there's several washouts on this grade. This is one of the more interesting parts of this plant site. An ocean dock on the angle because the water gets pretty deep very quickly offshore. That's why they angled them. This is the current location of the Burlington Northern from Tacoma, from Seattle to Portland, double track and so on. And what's of interest to me, amongst other things, is, well, here's an example of one of the small steamers they would operate on the Sound to carry the material. They shipped dynamite all the way up to Alaska and down to California, actually, and accessed all the ports in between. But what's interesting here for me is the tramway here, cables, carrying buckets of material up, and I'm under the impression that this was material going up and not anything was shipped down using the tram. All of that came down the rails. This is, of course, now is a fill and a concrete culvert with the track underneath. We'll see in a minute. I recall many years ago riding the train down to Portland, and I'm looking out the west side of the car, and down below me were these little tracks that came out toward the water. And I thought, wow, this must be a mine of some kind. Had no idea what it was, but it was the remnants of this trackage. This would make a great modular scene. This is on the dock, and you see the little 12-tonner and a string of cars. They've obviously collected quite a few down here, and they're maneuvering them on the dock. Notice also that the rail is on top of the planking instead of the planking in between the rails. And I've seen it both ways on docks. I think you'd worry about tripping on the darn rail as you're moving back and forth on the dock. I don't know what this rail does unless they had at one time a traveling crane on the dock, and there would have been this rail and one on the other side. There's a warehouse building here, and this is the dock for it. Up in the background here is that alignment of the BN main line to Portland. DuPont had a Navy, and this is the little tug that worked here at the plant, appropriately named DuPont. Heavy fingers. This is the trackage that still exists from in its original location underneath where that trestle was, and this is now a concrete structure. 30-pound rail, not terribly common anymore. The one thing to notice on the track is that it has tie plates. And I'm not tuned into too many narrow gauge railways of the 3-foot variety that had tie plates, but this one sure did. And we have a supply of them still, and if we wanted to lay rail to extend the trackage for some reason or other, on site near the museum at the where that display rail was and the building, we've got a pile of 30-pound rail. We had a bunch of ties, but they got rid of them because they tended to collect rats. Anyway, the track went out here, and this beach is all now eroded. And so this is the end of track. And the dock that we saw would have been right out about here. So this is the display. This is when we pretty much finished the 2 cars. They're behind the train, behind the locomotive. And we had sort of a filming of the first run of these cars behind the locomotive. Anyway, this is the locomotive all finished, and I have a video here if I can get it to run. All right. Well, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for the time together, and I'll open it to questions.
Thank you, Russ. Do you model any of this?
No, I don't, but I modeled a totally freelanced operation of fictional locations in the Northwest. But if I were to redo a layout, I'd probably do something like this, but probably in ON30, which seems to be an ideal scale for what this is. Very, very simple little operation, and this would be great for a starter for railroad for somebody who would like to do model building. You could do a lot of freelance structures to depict the types of structures shown in the various locations. Very simple track work. It's an opportunity to have some dual gauge with the standard gauge to indicate the size differences. And the equipment would be pretty straightforward to build. Like I mentioned, I have one of the little flat cars pretty well built now. I understand in order to qualify, I need to put an brake rig underneath it, which is very, very small. Fortunately, it's not N scale. I don't think you wouldn't hardly see this car if it was an N scale. But this little railroad is ideal for larger scale freelance or, modeling. And you can do it in a fairly small area.
So what kind of braking did they use on the cars?
Pardon?
What kind of braking?
Oh, these were all hand brakes with the, although the cars had air brakes, many of them had air brakes. And you notice on some of the photographs, 2 different sets of pipes for straight air and for handling the individual cars. I suspect going down grade, they would have turned up the retainers, so to speak, to retard the cars going down. Dynamite would have been fairly heavy, and you saw them stacked on those cars in the cartons. They certainly didn't want one to get away.
Was there, at this location that you showed, which I assume is a museum today?
Yes.
Was there any interchange with the main line?
No, the museum and where these cars are on display is well away from the actual plant. The Northern Pacific main line was easterly of the major map that I showed, maybe a quarter to a half mile, and the plant was reached from that main line up a long spur, and then headed east and west, um, where the locomotive collected the spark arrestor and went into the plant. That is the standard gauge. So there was no particular location other than that four large buildings where the materials were transloaded from the flat cars and box cars through a covered dock onto the standard gauge cars that were being shipped, where material was being shipped out by the Northern Pacific. The plant operated and built munitions for the war ever since 1906, all the way up through the Vietnam War. And I think it closed down because it just was no longer efficient. And with the change in materials used in blasting and so on.
So do other modern dynamite factories or places where they manufacture explosives, do they have rail service?
I suspect they do. The other part of this that's interesting to me is that you would have received chemicals of all kinds, acids and a variety of other caustics, etc., by rail. And so you had standard gauge tank cars coming into the site from the NP, and as well as box cars and flat cars loaded with other material.
Cool. Another question is, who was the largest buyer of this dynamite?
Well, of course, Weyerhaeuser Company itself bought an awful lot of explosives for all of their timber activities in the Northwest. But there were numerous mining areas of significance, like, for instance, Monte Cristo, up north and east of Everett, and up and down the coast, many large construction companies building roads and that sort of thing. Keep in mind that the interstate was built through this area in the early 60s. So some of the material for blasting came from there. I live in DuPont, which is a rail-served coal mining community, and they would have used quite a number of boxes of DuPont explosives. I have 2 of the boxes myself, just as collector.
So what piqued your interest to get involved with this?
Well, I went down with a friend. We went down to that barbecue, and I was just intrigued with the fact that there was narrow gauge in the Northwest, although there was narrow gauge here in Newcastle where I live. It didn't last very long here, but it lasted a long time in DuPont. And I was intrigued by the locomotive. We had a 12-ton locomotive, very small. And it just struck me that this was something that had modeling possibilities. I also had been involved in the rebuilding of standard gauge passenger cars at the Northwest Railway Museum here in Snoqualmie, which is east of where I live. And we built some 1912 rebuilt 2 passenger cars, Smith and Barney cars, for the SP&S that the museum has. They're wooden cars, wooden topsides and steel underbodies. So I spent like 7 years there, and so I had access to really good woodworking material and understood the techniques. And I commend it to anybody that's got the energy to do that, to get involved with a local museum where they always need volunteers.
Yes. Okay, a question about the factories maybe. Were the workers in the factory paid better?
I don't know that, but I suspect pretty well. It was somewhat hazardous. Keep in mind the time that we're talking about, coal miners and others in hazardous occupations. Timber, for instance, were not necessarily overly paid, but I think they were probably paid better than an awful lot of the menial jobs that were available.
Do you know how many people would have worked at this
Would have been
place?
several hundred.
Wow.
I couldn't get a good information on that from Jim Sable, but each of those buildings for packing material and so on would have had a crew of 4 or 5 people regularly, and I suspect they worked a couple of different shifts because uh, they produced quite a bit of material there.
And they all would have lived in the area, right?
Pretty much, yes. Uh, People drove to the plant site, and then they'd have to walk about a half mile from the parking lot into the plant. And which you think about that in the dead of winter, and then the snow and all that. That was just part of the routine.
So it was part of it safety or part of it being
Well,
hidden?
safety, the plant was isolated from the general population. That's why
Yes.
it was out there in 1,000 acres. And so I think they didn't want any large population around the plant. And then once you were on the campus, you were operating in smaller buildings or smaller groups in these scattered buildings. The buildings were spaced some several hundred feet apart in most cases, uh, except where they were loading finished material.
Cool. The at some point you had a photo, and I guess there was more than one turnout on it. And the question is, were those stub switches?
No, these were all, I didn't see any stub switches. They were all points, switch points. And we have the one example of the one turnout that's there on the display area. All of the switch points and frogs had been, they've been liberated, let's put it that way, from the remaining trackage that was there. Several chunks of rail are still on site.
And you
They're
mentioned the
too heavy
size of the rail, right?
to haul away. Pardon?
You mentioned the size of the rail,
Yeah, 30 pound.
30 pounds.
The smallest standard gauge stuff I've seen is 55 pound out at the museum in Snoqualmie.
So typically you would have to buy a smaller scales rail then, right?
Oh yeah. Well, the cars were not that heavy, and the smaller rail, of course, is going to be more easily curved around the sharper curves. Although, well, on the map, it appears that some of the access to some of the buildings were around fairly tight curves.
Did the workers wear any protective equipment
Yes,
things?
yes, they all had work gear that they wore when they were working in the buildings, and they would change into those at the beginning of a shift and hang their clothing up in the change house or change room, and then retrieve their going home clothing at the end of the day. I'm not sure whether they had showers there. I know that all of the coal mines typically had showers, but I suspect in many cases they did, where they were working around chemicals.
And the rail side of things, they were also wearing something special? The
No, I don't think
engineer
the
and the
locomotive
switchman.
crews coming from the NP were outfitted with any special outfit. Not, for instance, respirators or anything like that. Not aware of the use of respirators in this plant.
And did they
Maybe
have,
in the 50s and 60s they might have.
okay, did they have equipment available? I mean, like a fire extinguisher
Oh, I'm sure
somewhere?
they had a fire. They had designated places for fire suppression equipment, and so on. But let's face it, in a dynamite factory, if you have anything go off, a lot of it goes off,
Correct.
and so you really need a sponge and a wheelbarrow to clean up afterward.
I remember when we went to the grain elevator tour during the convention here, they have these chlorine rooms for when something there um, sets on fire, because it's another place where if a small fire starts, then it turns into a big fire quickly.
Oh yeah, well, elevators are very dangerous because of the dust,
Yes.
similar to coal mines. I don't think they. I'm not aware of any big bad accidents at DuPont. Um, it, I suspect if there was one, they would have been pretty well written up.
So this MMR business, how many certificates do you already have?
Oh, I've got 8 or so. The only one I'm missing is the rolling stock,
And you're
and
missing
I
this one
keep
car?
getting. Pardon?
And you're missing one car?
No, I've got one car done, and I need
Okay.
to finish the other 3. So I built a fire car from an old pickle car, actually, with a wooden tank on it, and I've turned it into a fire car for my SN3 layout.
So what's the plan for the other 3?
Well, I've got this one little 9-footer or 14-footer pretty much done, except for the steel work on it. It needs the end railings and like I mentioned, the underbody, that is the brake rigging, and then that's finished. And then I'm thinking of building a similar car, but with that work apparatus on it, the canopy and toolbox and all of that, all the junk that was on it, make it kind of a neat little model. That one almost begs to be modeled in a larger scale,
Yes.
as does that outside framed boxcar. I really like that one. That would be kind of fun to build.
You could also build that engine and put it in as a car.
Well, I've seen some beautifully done small engines like this done with styrene.
Hmm.
And although you could build it out of brass, but styrene seems to be the preferred method here. We have a local fellow that lives in Gig Harbor, Don Rose, who's routinely runs away with Best of Show at the narrow gauge conventions and symposiums that we have here. And it's all styrene.
Yeah, it's different when you build something to get it done and get it merited versus competing with someone else. That's another
Yeah.
level of commitment.
Well, the other group that we have out here that's pretty strong is the logging modelers. And many of them are incredibly skilled model builders.
Yeah,
And that is almost always scratch built.
well, sir, that's the extent of the questions, unless someone puts something new in. And that was a very, very nice presentation as well.
Well, thank you.
I was not going to attempt any of this because I always like to have an animation thing as part of a scene, and I think explosives I should probably stay away from.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, are you familiar with Laurie McLean in Australia?
yes, yes.
Builds beautiful, beautiful animation situations.
He actually uploaded a video either this morning or late last night into the interchange about
Oh, okay.
operating where the gate opens and
Yeah.
the blue flag comes up. And
I'll have one model from him that he gave me when he was here in 2012, of a blacksmith with the anvil and
yes,
and
yes.
all of that, and it functions. Very, very clever.
Well, one day we will convince him to join us here on NMRAx.
Oh,
He actually modeled the whole crew of us, with me sitting in a helix,
yeah.
and Martin with his hand, and Corey and Brad behind the computer, and we're all on a flat car moving through his layout.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, I'm sorry, at the very last slide that I have there was animated, and for some reason worked every time until today. Just as I had the locomotive coming out with the 2 cars on it, and we had a big grand opening of that with. And believe me, the people always will show up at a grand opening like that are the political people. So I had like 10 different bigwigs of one kind or another on top of those cars, trying to maintain their balance as the car moved down that track.
Hey, all you could have said is you're more than 30 pounds. Sorry, you can't go.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. It's a very interesting group, and the little museum is open 3 days a week, and it's reachable by just Google DuPont, Washington, and they've got a link on their website there. They're very, very welcoming.
Do you know which 3 days?
It's usually Thursday, Friday, and Saturday.
Well, sir, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you.
We will hopefully see you again. So maybe a narrow gauge layout presented to the whole world. And
Sure could.
thank you very much.
All right, thank you.